The rain drummed steadily against the diner windows, creating rivulets that caught the neon glow of the Blue Moon Cafe sign. Morgan Freeman pushed through the glass door, shaking droplets from his dark coat. The bell above chimed softly, but the warm chatter that should have welcomed him died instantly. It was supposed to be a simple dinner break during the third week of filming in Millbrook, Georgia, a town where Spanish moss hung like curtains and history seemed frozen in amber. The crew had recommended this place, said it served the best fried chicken for 50 miles. What they hadn't mentioned was how Chuck Morrison, the owner, felt about certain customers. Chuck looked up from behind the counter, his weathered hands freezing mid-wipe on a coffee mug. At 62, he'd run this diner for 30 years, serving truckers, farmers, and townsfolk who looked like him, talked like him, shared his convictions. He'd never expected to see Morgan Freeman, the Morgan Freeman, standing in his doorway. "We're closed," Chuck said flatly, though the open sign still glowed red behind him, and 3 customers sat finishing their meals. Morgan's eyebrows raised slightly, not in surprise but in recognition. He'd encountered this before, though not often in recent years. The other patrons shifted uncomfortably in their booths. One woman whispered to her companion. A trucker studied his pie with sudden intensity. "That's all right," Morgan said gently, his voice carrying that familiar warmth that had narrated countless documentaries. "Mind if I just wait out the rain?" Before Chuck could protest, Morgan had chosen a corner booth, the one with a torn vinyl seat that nobody else wanted. He sat down carefully, folded his hands on the scratched formica table, and looked out at the storm. Chuck stood frozen behind his counter. This wasn't how these situations usually played out. Most people left when he made his position clear. They got angry, demanded to speak to managers, threatened reviews. But this man, this famous, dignified man, had simply sat down as if he belonged there. "Nice place you have here," Morgan said conversationally, running his finger along the table's edge. "Reminds me of a diner my grandfather took me to in Memphis. Same kind of honest atmosphere." Chuck's jaw tightened. He didn't want conversation. He wanted this problem to disappear. But something about Morgan's tone, respectful, genuine, made him hesitate. "Family business?" Morgan continued, noticing faded photos on the walls. Chuck shaking hands with local politicians, standing proudly next to a younger version of himself and a woman who shared his features. 30 years, Chuck found himself answering, then immediately regretted it. "That's something to be proud of," Morgan said. "Not many places like this left. Real community centers. Places where people know your name, know how you take your coffee." The woman in the booth whispered again, louder this time. "Isn't that—" Morgan turned slightly and nodded politely. "Evening, ma'am." She blushed and looked away. Chuck watched this exchange, confusion clouding his features. He'd built his worldview on assumptions that were being quietly challenged by simple courtesy. "Listen, mister," Chuck started, but Morgan interrupted gently. "Freeman. Morgan Freeman. And you are?" "Chuck Morrison. Chuck Morrison of the Blue Moon Cafe," Morgan repeated, as if committing it to memory. "Chuck, I'm guessing you know who I am, and I'm guessing that's part of the problem here." Chuck's face flushed. He wasn't used to directness, especially not delivered with such calm understanding. "I got my reasons," Chuck said defensively. "I'm sure you do," Morgan replied. "Mind sharing them? I've got nowhere to be until this storm passes." This was Chuck's chance to justify himself, to explain his position. But as he looked into Morgan's patient eyes, eyes that had seen decades of struggle, success, and humanity. The prepared speeches felt hollow. "You people," Chuck began, then stopped. The phrase felt wrong suddenly, inadequate. "Which people would that be?" Morgan asked without malice. "Actors? Mississippians? People who wear dark coats in the rain?" Chuck's certainty wavered. "You know what I mean." "I know what you think you mean," Morgan said. "But I'd rather hear what you actually mean. What's your experience been, Chuck? What's happened to you that made you feel this way?" No one had ever asked Chuck that question. Not his friends, not his family, not even himself, really. He'd inherited his views like he'd inherited the diner, as something that simply was. "My father," Chuck said quietly, surprising himself, "lost his job at the plant. They said it was because of affirmative action. Had to sell the house." Morgan nodded thoughtfully. "How old were you?" 14. "That's hard. Watching your father struggle, feeling powerless. Did he find other work?" "Eventually, but—" Chuck's voice caught. "He was never the same. Proud man, broken down." "I'm sorry that happened to your family," Morgan said, and Chuck could hear he meant it. 14's old enough to understand poverty, young enough to need someone to blame. Chuck stared at him. "You're not what I expected." "What did you expect?" "Someone who'd, I don't know, fight back, make a scene." "Would that have changed your mind about anything?" Morgan asked. Chuck considered this. "Probably not." "Then what would be the point?" Morgan smiled slightly. "Chuck, can I tell you something? I've been where your father was. Lost work because of who I was. Watched my own father struggle to provide. The difference is, I had people who taught me that when someone's afraid or angry, responding with more fear and anger just makes the whole world smaller." The trucker at the counter was listening now, his fork suspended halfway to his mouth. The woman and her companion had stopped pretending to eat their dessert. "But your people," Chuck said, then caught himself again. "Black people. They get advantages now. Special programs." "Some do," Morgan agreed. "Just like some white folks get advantages from family wealth, connections, schools their great-grandfathers attended. System's never been fair to anybody, Chuck. But fairness isn't a pie where someone else's slice makes yours smaller." Chuck felt something shifting inside him, like a foundation settling. "I never thought about it that way." "Most people don't. It's easier to think in terms of us and them. But look around your diner, Chuck. You've got photos with politicians, community leaders, customers who've become friends. You built something here. Something that brings people together. That's not small. That's not nothing." Morgan paused, letting the words settle. "The question is, do you want to keep building, or do you want to keep those walls up?" The rain had softened to a gentle patter. Through the window, they could see the clouds beginning to break apart, revealing patches of star-filled sky. "I don't know how," Chuck admitted. "I don't know how to change." "Start small," Morgan said. "Start with one conversation. Start with one person you might have dismissed before. Start with curiosity instead of certainty." Chuck looked around his diner, really looked at it. The photos, the worn stools, the pie case his late wife had picked out 20 years ago. This place was his legacy. Did he want that legacy built on exclusion or on welcome? "The special tonight is meatloaf," Chuck said suddenly. "Made it myself, my wife's recipe." Morgan smiled. "That sounds perfect. And Chuck, I'd be honored to hear more about your wife while I eat." For the next 2 hours, they talked. Chuck told stories about building the business, about regular customers who'd become family, about the challenges of keeping a small-town diner alive. Morgan shared stories from sets, from his childhood in Tennessee, from a lifetime of playing characters who'd taught him about resilience and hope. When the other customers left, they said goodnight to both men, a small but significant acknowledgement. As Morgan prepared to leave, Chuck stood up straighter behind his counter. "Mr. Freeman," he said formally, "I owe you an apology. A big one." "You don't owe me anything, Chuck. But if you want to make amends, do it with the next person. Do it with the community you serve." Chuck nodded. Would you come back? If you're still filming here?" "I'd like that," Morgan said. "And Chuck, your wife had excellent taste in recipes. That was outstanding meatloaf." 3 weeks later, as filming wrapped, Morgan returned to the Blue Moon Cafe. The bell chimed the same welcome, but everything else had changed. Chuck greeted him with a genuine smile. The corner booth, the one with the torn vinyl, had been reupholstered. A small sign near the register read, "All are welcome here." But the biggest change was the conversation. Chuck had started talking to his customers, really talking. He'd learned that the young Hispanic family who'd moved to town were both teachers, that the elderly black gentleman who came in for coffee every Tuesday was a Korean War veteran. That diversity wasn't something that happened to his community. It was part of what made his community strong. As Morgan finished his meal, Chuck came over to the table. "I've been thinking about what you said," Chuck offered, "about building instead of the other thing. And I think I understand now. It's not about changing who I am. It's about becoming who I was meant to be." Morgan smiled and stood to leave. As he reached the door, Chuck called out, "Mr. Freeman, thank you for seeing something in me I couldn't see in myself." Morgan turned back. "Chuck, it was always there. Sometimes we just need someone to help us remember." The bell chimed as Morgan stepped into the Georgia evening. Behind him, the Blue Moon Cafe glowed warm and welcoming, a small beacon of change in a world that often seemed too set in its ways to transform. But Chuck Morrison had learned something that night in the storm. Transformation doesn't require dramatic gestures or grand speeches. Sometimes it just requires one person sitting down, one conversation at a time, and choosing to see the humanity in someone you thought you understood. 6 months later, the Blue Moon Cafe was featured in a regional magazine as a model of community hospitality. Chuck kept the article framed near the register, next to a new photo. Him shaking hands with Morgan Freeman, both men smiling, both changed by a conversation that started with rain and ended with understanding. The voice that had narrated stories of human struggle and triumph had, once again, helped write a new chapter, not on screen, but in the quiet transformation of one man's heart, one conversation at a time.